Thank you. I certainly feel welcome. You made me feel welcome. I sure have appreciated it. It's really a pleasure to spend a night in this fine hotel. I've stayed at university facilities before, so I thought I was prepared. I wasn't prepared. In fact, I didn't have a room. I had a suite. I didn't have anything to do with it, but the symbolism was there. It was really nice. It really is a pleasure to see, for me, for the first time, your fine facility that you've built here. And it's a wonderful experience for me to meet with you and your students. I appreciate it. I thought that you were going to, I almost had words in your mouth. I thought you were going to say, person is judged, by the number of children he has. And it's true, but it's not true that the oldest... so far. But it's not true that the senior in terms of age always is the first author. And what I would like to talk with you about this afternoon for the principal resource, my son Michael Gottfredson is the first author in the book, and I'm the second author. So I just thought I would mention it. They usually they do most of the work, and I get most of the credit. Alternatively, at lunch I explained that if someone expresses appreciation for some article, I accept that. I didn't do it, but I accept that. Then if they have criticism, I suggest the other guy. Forget about that. Since I'm looking at the dean, and since you mentioned I was dean for a little while at a first cousin program, I think it's like a first cousin. I could tell you what a dean is. I don't know if you know this. A dean is a person who's not smart enough to be a professor, but is not dumb enough to be president. So, anyhow, you're kind enough to allow me to select a topic, and I chose the rather grandiose topic called rational decision-making in criminal justice. It is a fairly grandiose sounding topic. I think it'll end up being somewhat simplified. I hope it will. Actually, my thesis has 3 points only. The first is that I would like to claim that there's a need for increased rationality in the criminal justice system. Then I'd like to claim that research about decisions in criminal justice shows 4 things. And then the third thing I'd like to claim is that this, including those 4 things, I'll list them. One, research shows what factors are most important in explaining decisions in the criminal justice system. Major claim to make. Second, that the concept of prediction is ubiquitous. Everywhere you find the concept of prediction in criminal justice decision-making. Third, that models for improved decision-making have been developed and implemented in some places, implemented successfully. And that all of this shows us, as a fourth thing, how decision-making can be improved. So I'm going to claim that we know some ways, specific ways, to improve rationality in the criminal justice system. Then the third major thing I want to tell you is that this won't address all our problems. That even if you do all I'm advocating, we still have a lot of problems left. So first, as to my claim for a need for increased rationality. Already I'm in trouble, as you would know, because there's a problem of defining the word rationality. And you know that philosophers for a few thousand years have debated what that means and what is rationality. One eminent philosopher of our time, only fairly recently deceased, is Bertrand Russell, who wrote in a book that he titled Unpopular Essays. He had a chapter called An Outline of Intellectual Garbage. And in that chapter, he began the chapter by saying, man is a rational animal. Or so I've been told. Actually, he said, I've searched on several continents for several decades, and found no evidence of it. He went on to say, by the way, that the reason man is said to be a rational animal, he traced to Aristotle, and he looked at Aristotle's reasoning for that, and he found that it was Aristotle made that claim because human beings can do sums. They can do arithmetic, so he said they're rational. Of course, we don't do much arithmetic anymore. We have a computer doing arithmetic, which probably only means we can make errors at a much faster rate. But anyway, it's hardly a definition of rationality, and hardly an argument that man tends to be rational. The people that have worked in the area of mathematical decision theory generally have a definition that goes something like this, that the rational decision is that decision which, in the light of the information available, will maximize the likelihood of attainment of some goal. That definition has three parts, as you might have noticed as I said it. And I would like to claim that any decision has these three parts. And it's meaningless to talk about a rational decision unless you consider these three parts. Those three parts are some goals or objectives, some information, and some alternatives. That's to claim that if you never know what the goal is, you don't have a problem of making a decision, a rational decision. If you don't have any alternatives, there's no decision to be taken. And if you don't have any information, you can hardly consider the idea of a rational decision that would optimize the likelihood of attaining some objective or goal. So these three parts are very important. And I'm claiming that we could analyze any decision, criminal justice decision or other decision, wherever we go in life, if we're concerned about a rational decision, we could analyze that decision in this way. Now, then I'd like to claim also that a useful way of looking at the criminal justice system is to regard the system as a series of decisions throughout the system. For example, that decision tree, for example, would probably begin most often with a victim reporting a crime to the police. Most ways you get into the criminal justice system start off with some victim complaining or reporting that a crime has occurred to the police. That's not invariably true. As you know, some police discover some crimes, probably not such a large share. Prosecutor may discover some. But by and large, the crimes we talk about, there's a victim reporting the crime. If the victim doesn't do that, which, by the way, happens in, is it the majority of cases? Certainly in victim surveys we would have data on that. Certainly a substantial number of cases, victims don't report crime. The criminal justice system, therefore, is never invoked. The issues that we're going to talk about don't ever rise. The victim didn't report that crime. But the victim had some decision to make in reporting the crime. Police officer comes to the scene. Police officer has some decisions to take, some objectives, some information, there are alternatives. Police officer, given circumstance, might have the choice of arrest or not arrest, might have the opportunity to issue a summons, do nothing, give some counseling, refer the person elsewhere. There may be a variety of alternatives to the police decision. So let's say the person is arrested and taken into custody, goes down to await a preliminary hearing. There may be a magistrate that has to decide on the matter of bail or whether the person be retained in jail waiting trial. Maybe some objective, like appearance for trial, commonly held to be the main objective. Might be other objectives, like the person going to do harm. Maybe issues whether that's constitutional or not constitutional, absent specific legislation. In any case, there's some objectives, some information about the individual, some alternatives to be taken. We could consider a rational decision. What would be a rational decision at this point? Person's kept in jail, didn't get released on recognizance, let's say. The administrator of the jail has some decisions to make. There might be very great concerns about suicides in jail, about whether there's a need for protective custody. Some of you are more experienced with this than I. You know what those decisions are. My only point is another series of decisions. Prosecutor has to make some decisions. Shall I press this case or not? Prosecutor must have some objectives. Must be some information. You choose to prosecute it. If he chooses to prosecute it, with what degree of vigor, what resources to devote here. Another important decision point. Prosecutors are skipping the trial phase, but say the person is convicted. The sentencing judge has alternatives, typically. Send to prison, send to jail, send to probation, split sentence, probation, jail. Go to lockup, how long? Usually quite a bit of discretion there for the sentencing judge. Well, I don't know if I need to go in. You go to corrections, you got a serious decision to make about placement in programs, Is this a counseling candidate? Is this a person that needs maximum security? Is there, information says there's history of escape, so, better look out here. There's a classification committee that maybe decides on treatment program, custody program, security issues, where to place the person, whole series of decisions. Parole board, next major example. In between, you have the corrections disciplinary committee. Parole board has those decisions to make, etc. So my claim is that at every step along the way, you can fairly describe the criminal justice process as a series of decisions. And my claim is it may be worthwhile to look at each of these decisions as potentially rational decisions in the light of what the goals are, information, and the alternatives. So if we did that, what's the nature of decisions that we would encounter? In criminal justice, typically at any of these decision points, the goals are unclear, or they're ambiguous, or they're utterly opposed to one another. I'm claiming. Correct me if I'm wrong. Information is lacking or not demonstrably related to goals. A distinction might well be made here between data and information. We're adjacent to a fine corrections program, I know that, but all corrections programs have a similar problem, which is this. We collect mucho data about the offender. A lot of data. We do it on an individual level basis. We have a thick case file. We have very little of that information, typically, extracted systematically and kept in such a way that we can study the relevance of those data to the goals we want to achieve. So we have much data and very often little information. If information is defined as that that's going to help in achieving a rational decision by reason of demonstrable relevance of those data to the objective. Well, I probably shouldn't dwell too long on that. I think probably you agree with that. It's mainly a claim for keeping records, keeping score, keeping data reliably, as accurately as we can, but keeping it systematically in such a way that we can study the relevance of those data for the decisions that we want to make in corrections and probation and in sentencing. But I have to hurry along because I claim that we know from prior studies, at least we know what prior studies show about the factors that are important in explaining decisions. And I claim that there are three that are important throughout this process. And the first is really pretty obvious. It's the seriousness of the offense. Every step along the way, you'll find that the seriousness of the offense turns out in some empirical study to be helpful in explaining the decision that was taken. In the bail decision, the seriousness of the offense is related to whether or not the person goes on ROR or not, and to the amount of bail. Seriousness of the crime. At sentencing, the more serious the crime, the more severe the sanction, ordered by and large. It's a good help as a predictor for the seriousness of the sentence. Parole board, seriousness of the crime, helps explain their decisions. All through you find that. It's kind of noteworthy to me that if you have a screening by seriousness of offense at every step along this process, and still at the end, still at the parole stage, it shows up as a helpful predictor of the decision outcome, how powerful a factor that is. Because you're taking a selective sample all along. The magistrate is only seeing cases screened somehow by police. The sentencing judge is only seeing people screened at that earlier stage, and so forth. And yet, all along, it keeps showing up as an important predictor. The second one that shows up repeatedly in all sorts of studies using different methods and so forth is somehow the prior criminal record of the offender. Prior record is important, again, all through this series of decisions. The third one is a little different, and I think it takes looking at these studies to notice this one, at least it did for me, and that is the personal relationship of the victim and the offender. And study after study, it turns out to be important whether the offense done or alleged to have been done is an offense against a stranger or a person known to the victim. So those three items tend to help explain or account for decisions all through the process. I claim that the goals are very mixed, in criminal justice. And I think you probably would agree with that. If you take goals such as retribution and goals such as treatment or even incapacitation or deterrence, it's pretty obvious that these are fundamentally opposed in many ways. They're philosophically fundamentally opposed, but also they may just work at cross purposes because there's no a priori reason to believe that the person who needs more punishment is the same fellow that needs more treatment. So it seems that it might be curious to find such consistency over so many steps in the criminal justice process with respect to major decision-making criteria. But it doesn't seem that it can be argued that these three criteria that seem to be taken account of everywhere can serve several masters according to different logics. That it may well be argued that the judge even may argue the person did a bad thing, he needs a lot of treatment. Treatment-oriented judge. Also, he did such a bad thing, he needs an incapacitation. So even though there are fundamental conflicts of aims that are involved, the major criteria that I mentioned might serve each of those masters, if you will. That brings up the idea that you might almost talk about two systems of criminal justice. The first being characterized by consensually defined very serious events, grave offenses committed by strangers. Also very, very much less serious crimes by people with minor or prior record or no prior record. The idea here is that for these events, I think it was mentioned this morning in our discussion, for these events there may be discretion available, but actually very little discretion is exercised in the criminal justice system. If you do a bad enough crime or have a bad enough prior record, you tend to go to prison. If you do a minor crime, have very little prior record, you're not. It's also the case that if you do a crime against a stranger, you're more apt to be locked up than if you do a crime against a non-stranger, family member, or whatever. It seems that all through the system, decision makers are wanting to screen those folks out of the criminal justice system, divert them from the usual process. Lesser offenses or lesser prior record or crimes not against strangers. So it's in that category, just as a young woman in our group mentioned this morning, it's in that category where the discretion is exercised most, and where we have, if we have it, we have disparity in the classification and placement decision and so forth. This is only to say there's very little argument about the extremes. And actually the criminal justice system looks pretty organized and pretty much like a system, despite, what we hear. It's in the middle range that there's a lot of discretion exercised, and that's where the discretionary decision ought to be examined. When you do look at that group, then it seems that factors other than the three that I mentioned come into play and play a larger role. For example, attitudes of the decision maker, maybe observations of the defendant's demeanor in the court, items of this sort. But it's in that middle range only. And it's in that range, I wanted to argue that the challenge to figure out how to control the discretion in a reasonable way is the greatest, and where the disputes about the most commonly held goals of criminal justice are most at issue. There it may be more important to know whether we're talking about treatment or punishment or whatever. Second general claim, I guess is the second one, is I claim that prediction is everywhere in the decision-making process. Ordinarily, each of these decision makers, it can be claimed as making some decision that has a predictive intent. The judge is making a prediction about what will happen if the person goes on probation or doesn't. The sentencing, the magistrate setting bail is making a prediction about appearance for trial and crimes. The correctional administrator is making a decision about whether the person is going to leave on minimum custody or whether the consequence of that would be serious after all, etc. So at every step, we could belabor the point, but the point is that prediction is there. Moreover, the concept of prediction is central to each of the major utilitarian goals of criminal justice that we here talked about, to wit, deterrence, incapacitation, or treatment. Might not be immediately obvious, but a prediction is involved if the claim is made that locking me up will warn you not to do what I did. It's a prediction that if I'm locked up, the likelihood that you'll do the same harm is decreased. Incapacitation, perhaps more straightforward, because now you're going to lock me up so I won't be doing harm while I'm in the community. And for treatment, if you place me in the rehabilitation program, you're making a conditional probability statement, in effect, that if Gottfredson goes to treatment, then his outcome will be such and such, which I think will be better than if you didn't put me in treatment. So, whereas where a prediction is not required is for retribution. Prediction not required for the desert orientation of criminal justice or sentencing. That is to say, if the purpose of the system is to punish for harms done in the past and to do so commensurately with the harm done, taking account of the culpability of the offender, then we're all through, and the prediction is not involved in that, because prediction is forward-looking, and desert orientation looks backward only to the offense that was done, to the harm done, and not to some future good that could follow. Now I claimed, making a lot of claims, I'm going to have to stop and hear the criticism of these claims, but I have my chance, I'll make claims. Claim that models for improving decision-making have been developed and implemented successfully, at least in this field, some places. So I'm speaking here about guideline models for setting policy, within which individual decisions may be made. Such models have been made and I think successfully used in paroling in at least one instance, in sentencing in at least one instance, and in bail decision making in at least two instances. It's a different story to talk about development of guidelines and models and controversies about that, but I only wanted to claim that it's possible to develop a model, which is a statement of policy, that at least provides for greater openness to the process, as an open statement of what the policy is, as opposed to a secret policy about which we ordinary citizens are not to be told. It's possible that such a model, by nature of its structure, will help to clarify the objectives, which I'm claiming is extremely important if we're going to talk about rational decision making. So it will clarify objectives maybe, and it will certainly clarify the procedures for the decision making tool. And there's good evidence from the several sites that I mentioned in this one sentencing example, bail examples, and the parole example, that such models can help increase equity if equity is taken to mean the similar treatment of similarly situated offenders, given that similarly situated is now going to be defined by the elements included in that policy model. That's a limitation, but nevertheless, I think such models have been shown to be of a help with respect to the disparity issue in decisions of this sort. These policy models have a few essential aspects that I would like to advocate. Here they are. The first is that it's a general policy for making decisions articulated in explicit terms within which individual decisions are made. So the first focus on general policy. Second, explicitly defined criteria are included for the decision making, with specific weights given to those criteria. It is explicitly defined what the basis for the decision would be. Then within the general policy model, guidelines are designed to be used in the process of arriving at a particular decision. The most important policy concerns, which have been decided by those who are responsible for the decision. In this logic, it would be the judiciary or the parole board, whoever, responsible for making that decision. They've defined those policy items, and they're reflected in the guidelines. And these guidelines are intended to structure discretion, but not to eliminate it wholly, I think is an important point. So that there are two ways with the kind of guidelines that I envision, and those are the examples I mentioned, where some discretion has to be exercised, must be exercised. One is in the typical situation where a grid defines a guideline, which, by the way, wouldn't be necessary, but it's a useful way to talk about it, I guess. Say the sentencing decision, like the Minnesota sentencing guidelines, is determined largely, at least the policy is determined by the intersection of column and row classifying an offender, there's some discretion within that cell. Not a lot, but some discretion within the cell. Furthermore, it ought to be insisted that there's discretion to depart from the guideline, expected sentence, when there are reasons to do so. And there can be valid reasons that will be accepted by the Supreme Court and others. But there could be a going out, and reasons should be required when the departure is made. Next would be that when those departures are made, the decision maker must provide explicit reasons for that departure, so they can be recorded and so forth. The next feature is that then there's a monitoring system to keep track of the reasons for departures, feedback then to the authorities, whoever they are, so that they might review and modify the guidelines, which in my structure they could do at any time because this would be their policy. Next point is that the general policy, including the guidelines incorporated in it, would not be regarded as a once and for all kind of procedure or a statement of a right policy, but rather would be designed overall to facilitate an evolutionary system of development, changing in response to experience gained by that authority, whatever it is, result in learning, social change, whatever. So what's wanted here, what I'm wanting to argue for, is an evolutionary policy tool, as well as a sentencing or paroling, whatever tool. A tool for framing policy, but also a tool for evolution of the policy and assist in formulating to the liking of whoever it is that we've selected somehow to be responsible for it. And next would be that the policy in general and the guidelines specifically would be open and available to public review and criticism and debate, which sounds offhand like nobody could disagree with that, but most of the decision making in this area is not public, open to examination of the policy, up for criticism and debate, and some use and statement. I'm arguing that this would be a help to getting up that debate. I'd like to mention some important features that such models might have that are not included in the list I just recited. For example, I didn't say anything about whether these guidelines are descriptive, just describing what's been done in the past, or whether they're normative, based on some theory or so forth. Those are important issues, but that's not what I'm talking about. I didn't say anything about the specific structure for guidelines, where it needs to be a grid. I don't think that's something. It could be a tree. I don't know. It could take all sorts of different forms. Our friend from Texas, your friend of mine, Ray Pinier, when he was chairman at one time of the parole board in California, didn't like guidelines. I talked with him about that and said, he says, no, we're not going to have guidelines. He said, we got this policy statement. And he showed me the policy statement. And it was on 3 or 4 pages sequentially. I could have taken Ray's 3 sheets and put them into a grid, but he couldn't have sold that, right? And a judge from Utah told me about the guidelines they had for the juvenile courts in Utah. And I said, Judge, how did you do it? How did you convince those other judges to these guidelines? He said, guidelines? They hate guidelines. They won't use guidelines. These are benchmarks. So it doesn't matter, what they're called or even what shape that takes. Another issue that I didn't mention is whether or not the concept of prediction is used in that matrix or in the guidelines or not. It might be used, it might not be used. The structure of those guidelines would depend upon, for example, your philosophy of sentencing, your philosophy of parole, whatever. So I'm making strong claims here that I know what's usually involved in decisions. I know where the important discretion is, where we got to focus. I'm claiming I know how to develop tools that will help structure discretion and make it more rational. I'm making a plea that we need a little more science here. We need more careful management, classification. We need to relate the data that we have to the goals we want to achieve, figure out whether the alternatives are effective, efficient, etc. It's somewhat a plea for science. Very much a plea for science. It's a plea for trying to make our aims more clear and consistent, agree upon them. It's a plea for examining alternatives and maybe inventing new ones. One of the most interesting things about alternatives in this decision model is that they're invented by someone, and people keep inventing new alternatives. That's an exciting thing about them. We can invent new alternatives, we can shape them better. I'm arguing that we need relevant information, which that's why that data system and all the analysis and stuff is required, because we need to know if the data are relevant to the decision we want to take. We just don't need a lot of data. We need information that will help us in pursuit of our objectives. I'm arguing that we need flexible decision structures, not rigid ones. A criticism of some things I wrote had the title Sentencing by Mathematics. I loved it because it shows me that those authors didn't read what we wrote, because we didn't advocate that. It's an easy one to criticize. Put that in the footnotes. It's too bad they didn't read what we wrote. They wouldn't have called it that. So I'm looking for flexible decision structures with some control of that discretion. I'm looking for a differentiation of case decisions and policy decisions. We're trying to mix the two so that case decisions are made within a consistent general policy. I'm calling for explicit policy and explicit decision rules. I'm calling for feedback systems in that system so that the policy can be modified. And I'm claiming what we need is an evolutionary process of development to get us on the road toward more rational decisions. But I wanted to claim furthermore that this wouldn't solve all our problems. It wouldn't solve a lot of our scientific problems, but mainly it's the case that it wouldn't solve any of our problems that have to do not with science but with ethics. Because a lot of the issues that are involved in that same decision process have to do not with science, but they have to do with values, they have to do with ethics. Debates about sentencing are bound to be at least as much about moral theory, ethical theory, as about any of the science that's involved. You almost have to get over the moral theory parts before you can even talk about whether the science is relevant to that. So in most of these decisions throughout the system, and I think it's fair to characterize the whole criminal justice system this way, that the issues of science and the issues of ethics are very closely intertwined, and it's very hard sometimes to sort them out. I think it's very important to try to sort them out, to be clear, when is it we're talking about an ethical issue, when is it we're talking about an empirical issue or a scientific issue. But it's at least clear that no matter how far we can get in science, it wouldn't solve all these issues because, principally because we live in a world of values as well as a world of science, and in a world of values, science can only play a part. I do think it can be a very useful, contributing part, but there's that main limitation. There's a short poem that I'd like to tell you about. It's so short I can even remember it, I think. I found it in the Scientific Monthly issue of 1948 by a gentleman named Clarence Wiley, who was a mathematician and engineer. And he's writing about science. And to me, the little short poem, brief as it is, conveys something about both the power and the limitations of science. It portrays a lot more. It portrays something about the epistemological position that I would like to take with respect to science and so forth. He called the poem Paradox. Paradox. And he wrote, he wrote, not truth nor certainty. Not truth nor certainty. These I forswore in my novitiate, as young men called to holy orders must abjure the world. If, then, this only I assert, and my successes are but pretty chains linking twin doubts, for it is vain to ask if what I postulate be justified, or what I prove possess the stamp of fact. Yet, bridges stand, and men no longer crawl in two dimensions. Such triumphs stem in no small measure from the power. This game, played with the thrice attenuated shades of things, has originates. How frail the wand, but how profound the spell. Thank you. Enjoy being here. We have discussion? Of course. Complaints, criticisms.
You've got sort of a little escape valve built into your system. You said that
glad of that.
judges must sentence in accordance with these guidelines, but they can make exceptions in this case if they state a reason. What's to prevent a judge from just saying, I want to go outside the guidelines just because I just feel like it ought to be done?
Yeah. No, good point. I was speaking too quickly and offhandedly. Clearly, you'd want those structured, first of all, so that whatever decision can be taken, even though it's a departure, is within the penalty prescribed by law. I mean, obviously, you can't depart from that. Secondly, I think it probably is a very fine idea to have some review system. I don't know whether it needs to be the Supreme Court of the state. In Minnesota, it is. But there is a review system set up such that unusual ones will be sent to the Chief Justice, and then a decision will be taken. So there's that kind of control. Also, they've developed various other rules. You can't make up reasons, for example, that are redundant with what's already included in the guidelines.
Well, in Georgia, they have, you talk about the word you use for appeal review system. They have a sentence review panel composed of like 3 or 4 Superior Court judges that review every case that's sent to them, review every sentence that's passed out.
I see. Yeah.
And they can overturn or reduce, or not overturn, they can reduce.
There would need to be some check on ridiculous reasons, I believe. Because judges will give them occasionally.
Because it sounds kind of like the mandatory sentencing thing, where we'll have a mandatory sentencing law. It doesn't work. They figure out a way around it.
In your experience, so in our decentralized system of justice, and we have in a lot of states, a lot of officials are popularly elected, and that goes from partisan elections to nonpartisan, quasi-appointment system. Do you think the electoral system or appointed system in the judiciary works any better in terms of working toward rational decision making?
I don't know. I don't have any evidence about it. I just don't know. We sort of have that mixture. It ought to be an empirical question to look at appointment versus election of judges. I don't know of any evidence. I would tend to I sort of feel like the appointment system might be better, but I don't have any reason. argue that way. What do you think?
It's an issue in Texas because it's going to be a challenge to popular elected judiciary here. It's in court now.
Well, maybe it wouldn't make much difference.
That's what I think. Human beings are human beings.
Well, some are tougher than others. I know when I was working in corrections, and I'd get inmates together, I'd make them be a parole board, and they were a lot tougher than the parole board. But the decision making was similar. I mean, they would be proportional. They were just tougher, I thought. But by and large, I don't know if it'd make much difference. Put any of us in to be a judge. We could do it. I mean, we might not like it, but we could do it. It might not be too different. So I think you need some rules to help us make decisions more comfortable.
My impression is that, so far as sentencing guidelines are concerned, that the main roadblock to it are judges themselves. They don't want it. How do you? And probably because of this, we're familiar with the judicial sentencing guidelines that were challenged by our judges, and from what I hear, more judges decided against it than in favor of it, except the Supreme Court later on said we can have guidelines based on some legal considerations. How do you sell these things to judges, knowing that they pretty much are autonomous, they're powerful, they don't want the discretion to be curtailed?
The only way I know to do it, I'm amazed that they've done what they did in Minnesota to invent a commission and lay down the rules, but then of course by that time judges are required to follow it, and judges do want to follow the law. So that's a little different scheme. I don't know how that came about in the legislature. I don't know. But the only experience I have is working with the judges to develop the guidelines, and same with parole boards. And what happens is, at first, they're very skeptical about it. Same with bail judges. Very skeptical about it. But if they're willing to collaborate in a study and go look at the decisions being made, show them the data, work together with them in a collaborative way, not just cooperative way, but the stronger word here, collaboration, so that you're part of a team working with those judges, and the product that's developed and invented is their product, then they want to use it and do it. That's the only way I know to do it. I don't know how to do it and impose it, unless you could, like Minnesota, get the legislature to do it. But my preference, anyway, is to work with the people who are responsible for it, so it's sort of like an action research project. And that I'm more comfortable doing that, and I enjoy that kind of work. So, but I think also that's, it's conceivable that's the best way to try to do it. Dr. Killinger?
Having been chairman of 3 different parole systems, the Pentagon, the federal for 10 years, and the state for 7 years, I feel that the big problem is in decision making. We have these tools, but when it gets down to it, you find one guy giving somebody 5 minutes, he doesn't go back and look at the material, and we have all the tools for the proper decision. The best parole board I ever worked on was at the Pentagon. We did 4 in the morning, we sat in bank, and the case was presented, and we did 4 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. When I went to the federal parole board in 1948, they were seeing 105 people a day, one man. And he came back and the other 3 members signed that I increased it to 5 members finally, and said no one could see more than 40 people a day and so on. Mm-hmm. But this is the problem, is parole is one of our most careful decisions we should be making. And you stay in court, well, with the Judy Baker trial for weeks, but somebody, when he gets up for parole, somebody was giving him a 5-minute interview and maybe reviewed by other people. The guidelines are there, they can use them, and it's better, I think, to have guidelines and have some statistical person back in the room working over all these points of positive and negative areas.
I think so. I think it can be a time saver as well, because if beforehand, I imagine you were probably supposed to give reasons for the decision in every case.
And really, they weren't giving decisions. They just I had a hard time getting them parole judge to write a summary after interviewing a case.
That's right, yeah.
And
And the reasons given then, you got this big volume and everything, the reasons tend to be, giving reasons tends to be trivialized. The reason would be, well, seriousness of the case.
when we stay in court with a trial with a defense attorney and a prosecuting attorney, you do get some feedback in both ways. But on the parole board, there's just that one person sitting
That's
there,
right, yeah.
and then the other members get mad if you dissent with them, this type of thing. There's a big problem. Sometimes I just think, well, prediction scale would be better if you used it completely. But in a system like Texas with 39,000 people and judges giving interviewers giving 5 minutes to a case, it's worthless.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of decision maker we should be making, because the man's going out into society. It's more dangerous to release a man than it is to bring him into the prison system making that decision. It should be just as important to keep him there or to get him out as it is when you're putting him in. But we do a lot of going in, but very little coming out.
Right, so it tends to be a cursory decision and not enough care given to it. I think that's true in a lot of places, just as you said, and it does help at least to have a clear policy so that it's going to enhance the chance that you and your colleague are going to agree at least. But also, even on the giving reasons that's a time saver is that then you don't have to give reasons. The reason is already stated in the policy. But you give the reason when it's departure, but see, that's only 1/5 of the time or something like that. So it actually can save time that way as well, so helping clarify the basis for your decision.
Seems like there's so much pressure from all three areas. The legislators get pressure to make longer sentences from the public who want to see criminals put away for life. Then there's the judges who see the same criminals every time, and I'm sure receive pressure from their constituents. And then there's the parole board that make their own decisions on whether the prisons are overcrowded or not. It's like everybody gets pulled from a different direction, and I don't see how you're going to develop one set of guidelines that's going to serve everybody.
I don't know. Okay.
You've touched on this in the sentencing process. Could you briefly discuss the application of this rational decision-making model to, for instance, federal judges in civil actions, school desegregation, jail, masters type thing, and compare that to the possibilities of expanding the model to, say, prosecutorial decisions and even to policing decisions on the street?
The second two would be easier for me than the first because I know so little about that, what goes on in the civil court, and what decisions would be. I think you could extend the logic if you thought about it like this. It's easier for me to say for a prosecutorial decision. You've got to first get the prosecutors to decide what the objective is. And that sounds simple, but I think it's not so easy because, the first claim is that, the objective is to, convict the guilty. But maybe that's not the main thing driving the decision. Maybe the main thing driving the decision is winning. Probability of winning might be the most important thing for an individual prosecutor, which is reasonable. It's not even putting them down, but the prosecutor who aspires to be governor is going to have to win cases. So the probability of winning would be a measure he'd probably want to have. Then probably, though, there's some kind of a mixture that may have to do with the seriousness of the case, that he's going to devote more energy and resources, or it may be a more valuable case to win with a more serious case and so forth. So I think it's complicated, but I think you could do it, and you could get prosecutors to structure both what they're trying to do and the information available, and you could study the information available in a similar sort of way. With police decisions, I think so, with many of them. Again, it would force the concept that you have to be more clear about what the objectives are. You'd have to be more clear about examining what information does the police officer have to work with at that moment. That might be a healthy exercise. So I think it could be done. I suspect it could be attempted in this civil arena. I don't see why not, but I just don't know at all about it. So, okay.
Part of the problem, maybe more of a comment than a question, part of the problem when you structure decision making is you open yourself up to a lot of lawsuits, potential lawsuits. And I'm saying this in terms of police work and in terms of parole work. Because in police work, for example, say you structure police decision making in the different areas of responsibilities, when you deviate from that structure, you open yourself to charges that you were negligent because you did not follow departmental policies. The same is true with parole boards. I think one of the main reasons that parole guidelines have not become more popular than they ought to be, I guess, I don't know what the latest count is, but the last I heard something like 14 or 16 states had parole guidelines. One of the reasons is that when you have guidelines, then the courts will hold you responsible for those guidelines. And if therefore you don't release somebody who falls within the guidelines, then you open yourself up to a lawsuit. So there are consequences to it.
That's true. See, I think it's better to have an avenue to challenge. Better to have a policy that's explicit, be able to challenge it. I think that's a value.
If you're a plaintiff's side, if you're a plaintiff's lawyer,
if I'm a recipient, then I'm going to be wary. It's understandable that they will be wary. That's why I think you're quite right. Mr. Kim?
What's the place of individual criminal in his decision-making in the whole process?
Oh, yeah, well, that's a whole different book that you'll have to write. It's about the decision-making of the offender, right?
Each decision-making process
In the criminal justice system.
will take decision-making through his own defining, through his own definition. You know, when prosecutor is making particular decision, and then that particular decision will be defined by the individual offender differently from other individual offender. You know.
No, I see.
So
I see, yeah.
So if we don't look at the other part of decision-making process, then we will see,
No, I think that would be right. You could look at those decisions. See, I thought you were going to talk about the decision of the offender to do the crime, whatever it is. So it was sort of like it's called now rational choice theory. And then, you know, then the opportunity structure becomes important. But you're talking about along the way, what decision does the offender make? For example, with the prosecutor and the defense, you know, about the plea bargain, or maybe with the court. I don't know. I think it's an interesting point. So your point is, if this is left out, you're going to have a biased view of what all is going on.
So I would include the individual criminal in your tree of decision-making process. The very first beginning, before victim's decision-making.
Well, you want the whole story, then you've got to begin before he does the crime, right? Right. I agree.
But aren't your guidelines that you've got built in, these substance guidelines you've got built in, sort of for the protection and benefit of the offender in some way? We'd like to protect him from, you know, getting 20-year sentence when probation and community service might be just as appropriate.
Well, that would be my hope. Yeah, that would be my hope.
So the offenders, the criminals' welfare is taken into account, right?
Well, I hope so. And an initial thing is just a matter of equity. And, you know, that's a value. But just to lessen disparity, I would see as an important value. But I would say, yeah, and then I would like to argue about, see, that gets into points about guidelines that I wanted to exclude, because I want to talk just theoretically about the concept. But then you come to how do you use them and what gets imposed, then I would like to argue, you know, about other things, like let's divert some of these folks from the prison system. We've got intensive probation, supervision, we've got other things to do. We've got a terrible overcrowding problem. That can we use this kind of logic to maybe scrape it out. But I think that's a whole different set of concerns that's outside the logic of having the guidelines itself. And my fear is if I talk about those things, then the more important concept about decision policy development. I'd lose the argument on the wrong ground.
One of the concerns I've had in watching jurisdictions adopt guidelines is that the concept is not necessarily bad, but the reason for adopting it has nothing to do with the reason it was designed. The primary impetus in the 80s to move toward guidelines to people who want to spend money on punishment. I think the clarion in the 80s has been get tough on crime and no new taxes, and did not do a good job for you, which has destroyed rationality and justice in jurisdiction after jurisdiction. So state legislatures, when they find out about guidelines as a way of saving prison construction costs or jail, they say that's a good idea, and then when they don't work, they make them more and more plastic. In other words, it's the unwillingness to spend money was to get elected, get tough on crime, no new taxes, and then we'll look like we're tough. But proportionally, fewer and fewer people are going to prison today, and yet we have greater and greater penal sanctions. And there's a hypocrisy in that. And I think originally when people thought about guidelines, let's say the theoreticians were thinking, well, this would be a rational way to approach sentencing, and this would be a way of correcting disparities in sentencing. All right motives. But what got the job done was politicians that said, I want to look tough, but I don't spend any money. In fact, I really don't want anybody to go to prison. Or if they do, I want them there for about 10 minutes, and we're going to move them out. So that parole doesn't exist. I mean, it's hard to find parole in the United States today. I mean, it's a cap control mechanism. And that's been corrupted so much that you have offenders today, when offered a plea, say, I want to go to prison. I don't want probation, 10 years, pee in the bottle, be in house arrest, and then get up every morning, pay the victim, pay the fee, pay for my own treatment. And then the prosecutor says, no, that's not how we play the game. You finish it, yes, it is.
The person has the right to punish.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sincere. If you, agree with that what's good in a lot of it from the 80s gets up on crime and taxes, what a good job it did for you. And secondly, those policymakers that invented that can never come out if that's up to present work, or they wouldn't get elected again. Are we looking at that, do you think, through the 90s as well? That these technologies, into which I would have a lot of the diversionary programs that people invent for the right reasons are being adopted for the wrong reasons, and probably underfunded to boot. Have we, through that hypocrisy, set ourselves on a course through the 90s that there's no way we can get out of, because no one would have the nerve to fess up to the public that it was all sham in the first place? Good ideas implemented for the wrong reasons, and they don't work.
I think a lot of what you're talking about, I think I understand and I agree with, but I don't think guidelines are particularly culprit. New Jersey, we're building prisons as fast as we can do it. The curve's a mighty steep one, for us it's a big problem. Got proportionally at least as big a county jail backup as you all have in Texas. I mean, it's a terrible problem. We don't have any guidelines, but we sure have a demand to increase penalties all along the way. So somebody's going to have to confess up to what a sham that was, because it was unrelated to crime rate. We know it is.
In New Jersey, they're converting civil judges to criminal justice.
That's right.
Yeah, which means civil dockets back up because the legislature didn't want
That's right.
courts either.
So does the county jail back up. Yeah, they both back up. That's right.
And
You get more judges sentencing.
For that, I think guidelines were rationally conceived, but the impetus in a lot of jurisdictions for using them, I think, is for the wrong reason, not to improve rationality. It's to perpetuate the image of our crime and taxes.
It was argued this morning something to the effect too that it gave a handle on which you could hang the increased punitive attitude. So we were going to get tough anyway, but this gave a way to do it, and it probably enhanced that. Was the argument I was claiming? Don't blame me; it would have happened anyway. But there may be some merit to that argument.
Must we consider the role of the judge to be central to sentencing and his power to be almost omnipotent? It can be said that the power of a district attorney in sentencing and his role in sentencing is even more important than that of the judge. When we take into consideration that roughly 90% of cases of plea bargain, the judge is virtually rubber stamp what the district attorney wants to give. And yet, again, my impression is that we have started to get a handle on the discretion of judges. We have not started to do that among prosecutors. Why?
I don't know. I wish somebody in this room would go do it, to tell you the truth. I don't know.
It's not been studied either.
Not very much. There are few studies of the prosecution decision-making. We can find some studies, but I don't know of any attempt to develop a policy of this sort or guideline structure. I agree with you as to its importance.
Theory, and maybe also, and it is that I think it's easier to get hold of formal decision-making, to structure formal decision-making, as in the case of judges, as it is in an informal decision-making process, as in the case of prosecutors.
Right, maybe.
It's invisible, nobody knows what they're doing. It's a matter of talking, conversation between them, the defense lawyer.
I don't know how we get them to do it. I mean, it seems to me it would be hard to convince prosecutors to collaborate in this way. I mean, they don't need the policy even quite as much as the parole board might or sentencing court might. It's nice that it's a hidden policy. It's not explicit, and there's a lot of flexibility. It's pretty comfortable. Nobody's challenging that. I don't hear people getting on the prosecutors. They get on the courts.
A lot of prosecutors' offices have formally written bounds for plea negotiation. They'll say certain kinds of cases. For example, in Harris County, burglary of private residence by night, automatic prison. And if the prosecutor negotiates something different than that, then he's got to go in and talk to the DA.
But self-imposed though. Not
They're
imposed.
internally generated.
Yeah.
Usually by the prosecutor, that is the chief.
Wasn't that part of the Washington guidelines? Didn't they have a spot in there on a prosecutor?
In D.C.?
No, state.
I don't know.
I think they had a spot in there on prosecutorial discretion, setting up some very minimal guidelines, but guidelines nevertheless. They looked at Maryland and Pennsylvania and Minnesota and some of those and said, well, this is a big problem, so we're going to incorporate it just a little bit. I think it was in Washington State.
Huh.
I guess part of the problem is that when you talk with judges, you have the Supreme Court of a particular state that may have some jurisdiction or control or supervision of judges. You don't have a similar body with prosecutors, because they're not under the Attorney General's office, they're under nobody. The only constituency is those people who voted into office, the county.
Yes, usually the case. In our state, it happens to be different because they are under the Attorney General's office. There's a division of criminal justice, in New Jersey. But I think that is unique. It's usually a county function. Dr. Cunningham,
Going way back to Lloyd Olin, I mean, if nothing else came from first thoughts of prediction scales of this type of thing, it would cause individualization to some degree. I mean, before that, you didn't look at the individual, and we still don't look at the individual. And if prediction scales are any kind of help in that regard, getting us to an individualized system, that's what gets me, is this thing of handling great numbers, mass treatment. That's what we're still doing. And if we use guidelines along with other things, but anything to make you look at that person, we still don't have enough individualization and enough people, enough time to turn all these people loose, especially at the pro level. We don't know whether they're ready or not. And you say, go back and look at, was it against a relative, against a person? What is this man's background? He may be in there this time on a misdemeanor, but if you don't go back into the background, look at the criminal record that preceded this.
Yeah, just the sheer volume is such a problem in itself that it seems to me that at least we could nurture the hope that if we can do anything to help deal with that volume in a more reasonable way, it could free us up to do more of what you're talking about. Whether it would or not, I don't know, but I would be with you and I would hope so.
I remember a prisoner I had in Atlanta years ago, he came up and said, I waited 20 years to go in there to that parole board, but that guy didn't know one thing about me.
Yeah.
And that's where I decided, I'm going to know more about that guy than he knows about himself.
Yeah.
If I have to deny parole or grant him parole. And that's what we still got. And if any kind of tool or statistical analysis that we can have to help us know the individual.
Sure.
A couple of points. One, since, as I mentioned to you at the break, a lot of the prosecutors and a lot of the judges are egotists and they have this giantly inflated egos and they want full discretionary power, especially the judges. They don't want to be harnessed by sentencing guidelines. What about taking this as not as a a mandate to judges, but part of the pre-sentence hearing or pre-sentence investigation where this would be more or less the guidelines that would be the foundation for the pre-sentence investigation, and then you have input from the prosecutor and the judges.
Okay.
And the other thing that I was going to throw in, from a corrections standpoint, a lot of the criminals that are incarcerated don't view incarceration today as much of punishment. So sentencing an individual to prison, that individual, if he is of a type, I hate to say criminal element, but this individual goes, especially the recidivist, that has been there before, doesn't view incarceration today as really true punishment in the sense that the ones that I knew. Well, a lot of it's because of the federally mandated inmate rights litigation that's taking place.
Are we all through?
One other question.
Yes, sir. Okay.
You're an advocate for structuring discretion, and I think so are most of us. Have we made sufficient strides, though, in the various areas of criminal justice? Or are we, from your perception, really lagging behind?
Do we know enough about how to do that? I mean, is it?
Exactly. You, for example, identify such areas in courts, particularly judges and district attorneys, in the police area, and in the corrections area, probation, parole, and institutions. Have we made sufficient strides in structuring discretion and coming up with guidelines to a point where now than we were 10 years ago?
I think so. I think we know how it can work. And I think we know a lot about how it's not easy. I think we know a lot about how to do it, which does mean, I think, working with those people. Kind of action research programs, what you have to do. If you don't, you try to impulse it. We know it doesn't work. So I think we do have enough experience to know how to do it in such a way that has a good chance of working. I think we've learned that much. I don't think we know very much about it. But I think, I thought I came here to claim, yeah, we know that we can do that. That was sort of my argument.
Gottfredson, if you know enough knowledge of movement of sun and moon, which is beyond our control, which is beyond the sun's control or moon's control, then we can predict and we can say exactly what will happen the next day. But since we're dealing with the individual, and I don't think that even though we have accumulated enough knowledge of each decision-making process, still, as long as we can control, political scheme or something else, then we never achieve the goal. But at best we can eliminate those irrationality which can inflict damage to the individual criminal or in society at large, and we can eliminate those negative factors. But I don't think that.
No, I think I agree very much with what you're saying. For example, I wouldn't say, despite those studies from Lloyd Olin and others, going back in history, there have been a lot of studies along that topic. But we haven't learned so much about just that particular problem, despite the shells we could find in the library here. But we haven't learned enough from that to tell us anything about how to set policy. But that doesn't mean we haven't learned anything either. If we know what the policy looks like, then we can figure out whether, well, it's not true we can't predict at all, but it's true that it's very modest. We'll make a lot of errors. If we know that, there still may be some way that tool may be useful to us. That's all I would want to say. But I wouldn't set any policy on what we know about predicting behavior. I would probably set it on what we know, what we don't know, or more about what we know the errors will be, and I'd be concerned about the errors. But one thing I was wanting to argue is that you can hardly escape this topic of prediction, because everybody's going to make predictions, whether they use the tool that you invented or not. They're going to make some kind of prediction. And it's the same prediction, whether it's a subjective prediction or use of the tool only, tool and subjective. However, there's still a prediction, and the result of that is that errors will be made. So there's more of a focus on error, in a way, and what I'd like to advocate, than there is on the lack of error. So let's get busy making these mistakes. Thank you very much.